Now, on to tonight's stellar lecture. Ann Seltzer, an adult school board member, will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Mark. Good evening. Speaking personally, I have loved hearing all of the choices that the speakers in this lecture series have made about the ideas that have changed their field of interest most significantly in the last 75 years. One perspective that seems to have emerged from each lecture is how the discoveries or thinkings in their field hold so many implications, in fact, so many applications for thinking in related fields, which is one reason why tonight's lecture by Dr. Angela Crager is particularly interesting and will be particularly intriguing. She is the Princeton University Philip and Beulah Rollins Professor of History. Her principal field of focus is bioscience, but Dr. Crager comes to it with an exceptional multidisciplinary range of knowledge and interest, which will inevitably help all of us imagine what the future may hold. Reading her resume is frankly just plain exciting. Dr. Crager has a PhD in biochemistry from the University of California at Berkeley, a BA in chemistry and English from Rice, where she was a Phi Beta Kappa. She has had postdocs at Harvard, the Mellon Foundation, and many other places. And she has many awards to her credit. So I'm only going to mention three that will give a sense of the range of her curiosity and talents. In 1998, she was awarded the Princeton University President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. She's held an NEH Fellowship Award for Peace and Health. And she is a National Science Foundation Career Award winner. I was also fascinated by the range of courses she has taught at Princeton University at both a postgraduate and an undergraduate level. She has taught a seminar on gender and science, a freshman seminar, Life as We Know It, A History of Biology, a course entitled Darwin's Century, another, Atomic Legacies, and one on the history of technology. The author of many articles and edited volumes, Dr. Crager has also written 3 books, all published by the University of Chicago Press. Her latest book, Life Atomic, A History of Radioisotopes in Science and Medicine, was just published this fall. Science Magazine's superlative review of her book ends with, quote, Crager's deft attention to the ironies that have accompanied efforts to harness the atom is history of science at its best, a crystal clear portrait of just how untidy impacts of science can be, unquote. So now I'm going to sit down and enjoy this talk by Dr. Crager, and we thank you very much.
Thank you. This is the second opportunity I've had to speak to Princeton Adult School, and it's wonderful to have a chance to talk about a book that was so influential in my own field. Let's see. I think it's on now. Yeah. Maybe there's a battery down. This mic, is that okay? Yeah. That'll work, right? Okay, so I just have to not wander around, which is hard for me. That's fine. Okay, so. There we go. In 1962, a physicist turned philosopher published the latest installment of a series entitled The International Encyclopedia of Unified Science. a group of philosophers known as the Logical Positivists, or the Vienna Circle, had inaugurated this series of 19 monographs that were published from 1938 to 1969. The author of this volume, Thomas Kuhn, had been denied tenure at Harvard University and was teaching at Berkeley in both the history and philosophy departments, although he had no formal credentials in either of those fields. His book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, challenged a progressive and rational understanding of how science develops, arguing that changes occur through revolutions as researchers move from one overarching paradigm to another. Despite the many criticisms of its picture of science, the book went on to achieve blockbuster status. And just to show you some of the additions over the years, to the far left, you can see the original imprint as part of that encyclopedia. It was then also published that same year under its own cover. And in 1970, University of Chicago Press, which published all of these editions, brought out a new edition with a postscript by Thomas Kuhn that I'll speak to later. So this is the second edition. It was reprinted in the 80s with this Escher-like schematic diagram on the front. Then in the 90s, University of Chicago Press brought out the third edition, and finally last year they brought out an edition for the 50th anniversary of the book, which I own, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. How many people have read this book at one time or another? Well, not as many as I would have expected. It's actually a really good read, so you should go home and read it. Easy to get. So I just should mention, I still teach this book at Princeton in my Historiography of Science course. I don't think it's going to cease being a classic anytime soon. So this unusual book became the most cited academic work in all of the humanities and social sciences between 1976 and 1983. It was cited more than classic works by Sigmund Freud, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Noam Chomsky, Michel Foucault, or Jacques Derrida. By the mid-1980s, nearly 1 million copies had been sold and more than a dozen foreign language editions published. Kuhn's phrase, paradigm shift, showed up everywhere from business manuals to cartoons. I'll just show you one of the many New Yorker cartoons that has been keyed off the paradigm. I'm afraid you've had a paradigm shift. So this evening, I want to say a bit about how Kuhn came up with the ideas in his book, take you through its argument, and then focus in on one aspect of the book that I have found especially useful for my own work, analyzing biological research. And in doing so, I hope to show you why the book is still relevant for history of science 50 years after its publication, 51 years, and why it deserves a place in your own Diamond Anniversary. Now, after finishing his PhD, Kuhn began teaching Harvard undergraduates the history of science with the college's president, James Conant, who was a chemist and had an interest in the subject. This was part of Harvard's general education program, which devolved into the college's core curriculum later. And what Conant and Kuhn did was to select episodes from the history of science to serve as case studies from which undergraduates could understand the scientific method. And they were really convinced that this would make Harvard undergraduates, even those that didn't major in science, into better citizens in an American democracy. And as you can see, the cases that they collected with the primary sources they used were then published as these Harvard case histories and experimental science. There are 2 volumes of them. Their examples included the transition from Aristotelian to Newtonian mechanics, Lavoisier's chemical theory, especially how oxygen theory replaced the phlogiston theory in explaining combustion, Franklin's work on electricity, and the debate over spontaneous generation between Louis Pasteur and Felix Boucher, for which I've actually dug into this case history source myself. Kuhn realized that past science includes knowledge that is incompatible with current science. And rather than try to understand past science in terms of contemporary science, he finally decided that the best way to understand the history of science is to approach obsolete knowledge on its own terms. As he said at the beginning of his book, historians of science ask, for instance, not about the relations of Galileo's views to those of modern science, but rather about the relationship between his views and those of his group, i.e. his teachers, contemporaries, and immediate successors in the sciences. Now, in turn, taking obsolete science seriously meant that one actually could not easily distinguish between science and error, or even superstition. The more carefully one studied Aristotelian dynamics, phlogiston chemistry, or caloric thermodynamics, the more certainly a historian of science came to see that these once current views of nature were neither less scientific nor more the product of human idiosyncrasies than those current today, that last phrase being a quote from Kuhn. This even applied to myths. As he said on page 3, if these out-of-date beliefs are to be called myths, then myths can be produced by the same sorts of methods and held for the same sorts of reasons that now lead to scientific knowledge. If, on the other hand, they are to be called science, then science has included bodies of belief quite incompatible with the ones we hold today. What made something science was not its correctness, but its structure. The fact that there was a paradigm guiding the research in a particular field of knowledge. And so Kuhn picked up this word paradigm from grammar. So as you all know, I'm sure, a paradigm refers to a pattern for conjugating, for instance, a verb. For Latin, amo, amas, amat is a pattern and term for other verbs such as laudas, lado, laudas, laudat. Similarly, Kuhn thought that there were particular achievements in science that provided a pattern for solving other problems, and this is what he referred to as paradigms. He said a paradigm is an accepted model or pattern. Paradigms gain their status because they are more successful than their competitors in solving a few problems that the group of practitioners has come to recognize as acute. So take, for example, how particular paradigms for what should be known guided certain kinds of determinations in science, he said. So in astronomy, the determination of the stellar position and magnitude, the periods of eclipsing binaries and of planets. In physics, specific gravities and compressibilities of material, wavelengths, and spectral intensities, or in chemistry, the composition and combining weights, boiling points and acidity of solutions, structural formulas, and optical activities were all properties that were determined based on one example, and other scientists then looked at other compounds, elements, planets, what have you, to determine their characteristics in the same way. And this is what Kuhn referred to as paradigm-guided research. So paradigmatic experiments then did two things. They solved enough new problems to attract researchers away from competing theories, and yet they were open-ended enough to leave all sorts of problems for the redefined group of practitioners to resolve. And practitioners who did this kind of work were said to engage, by Kuhn, in normal science. And he uses normal here not in a pejorative sense, but in, just to characterize the sense. It's not a bad thing to be doing normal science. But this is the productive phase of scientific research in which researchers are all engaged in producing new knowledge in an exercise that is like puzzle solving in Kuhn's view. And strikingly, he said, most of the discoveries in this productive phase of science do not challenge the status quo. As he said, perhaps the most striking feature of normal research problems we have just encountered is how little they aim to produce major novelties, conceptual or phenomenal. We often think about science as always being innovative, but in this view, in fact, much of science is extending knowledge that we already know into new problems or new materials, but not actually overturning commonly held ideas. However, over time, Kuhn said, problems do eventually crop up, findings that don't fit the paradigm or pieces that don't fit the puzzle. Kuhn referred to these problems as anomalies. And here he relied heavily on new work in experimental psychology to illuminate how difficult anomalies were to comprehend. He said at first, researchers couldn't even recognize that the problems didn't fit the pattern they were used to. And tellingly, he drew on an experiment that had been published by Jerome Bruner and Leo Postman on playing cards. And what these psychologists did was to expose subjects very briefly to playing cards and ask them to identify them. But the deck included some cards that don't actually exist in reality. So a 4 of hearts that had black hearts, or a 6 of spades with red spades. Now what happened when the subjects would see these cards very briefly is that they would simply misidentify them. They would either misidentify, the clubs or the spades or the color. Something would be wrong. They would fit it into the pattern that was already familiar to them. But as they were exposed for longer periods to these cards, the subjects would begin to get uncomfortable and hesitant in assigning the identity of these cards. Finally, they would catch on to the fact that the deck had cards that didn't exist in normal decks. And once they could identify the anomalies, they wouldn't have any trouble. There were subjects, however, that could never catch on to the anomalies, and who, even as they were exposed to the cards for longer amount of times, grew more and more anxious and uncomfortable. One quote from this study has a subject saying, "I can't make the suit out, whatever it is. It didn't even look like a card that time. I don't know what color it is now, or whether it's a spade or a heart. I'm not even sure now what a spade looks like. My God." So the point is that we have these conceptual frameworks, and we always try to fit new observations into conceptual frameworks. And Kuhn really argued that this is how scientists work as well. And he called this this experiment, quote, "a wonderfully simple and cogent schema for the process of scientific discovery." And to give you another quote, he says, "In science, as in the playing card experiment, novelty emerges only with difficulty manifested by resistance against a background provided by an expectation. Initially, only the anticipated and usual are experienced, even under circumstances where the anomaly is later to be observed." Another set of examples that Kuhn drew on to try to explain what the paradigm is like is from Gestalt theory, and especially drawings that could be seen in more than one way. So, as you probably can see, you can either see this as a rabbit or a duck. I actually find the rabbit easier to see than the duck, but depending on how you orient the face, it can be either animal. Now, Kuhn said this is not a perfect analogy because scientists can't choose whether they want to see the duck or the rabbit. We can all sit here and flip between one and the other. He said the scientist really is much more trained into a paradigm and can't just kind of flip the lenses. Nonetheless, he said, when a paradigm changes, it is like this kind of Gestalt shift. What were ducks in the scientist's world before the revolution are rabbits afterward. No ordinary sense of the term interpretation fits these flashes of intuition through which a new paradigm is born. So once a new paradigm is available, scientists begin to switch, but they can't inhabit more than one conceptual framework at the same time. Moreover, there emerges a kind of circularity in how paradigms are defended or advanced, because a scientist who's arguing in favor of a paradigm will draw on the tenets and aspects of the paradigm itself to argue for it. And Kuhn described this in the following terms. He said, like the choice between competing political institutions, that between competing paradigms proves to be a choice between incompatible modes of community life. Each group uses its own paradigm to argue in that paradigm's defense. In part here, he was trying to challenge the idea from philosophy that theory choice in science could be boiled down to rational rules. He said always you first have a commitment to a certain conceptual framework, and then you decide which theory works. You can never make an independent determination of which theory is best. Now notice here his analogy to politics. At other times in the book, he refers to conversion. So in this sense, his choice of the word revolution isn't incidental. He really sees this commitment as being a personal commitment, as a social commitment, and you can only belong to one party or another, or you can only have one belief system or another. Now, another aspect of this is that the incompatibility of paradigms is so real and unbridgeable that it can be impossible for people in different paradigms to communicate effectively. Language itself breaks down. He referred to this feature as incommensurability. He said the normal scientific tradition that emerges from a scientific revolution is not only incompatible, but often actually incommensurable with that which has gone before. There's no way to translate the terms easily. You always lose something in moving from one paradigm to the other. And language itself can break down in trying to communicate between these two different ways of seeing. More radically, Kuhn suggests that when scientists change paradigm, the world itself changes because the perceptual apparatus that accompanies the paradigm is so deep that the world actually looks different. Just to give you yet another quote from Kuhn's book, examining the record of past research from the vantage point of contemporary historiography, the historian of science may be tempted to exclaim that when paradigms change, the world itself changes with them. Led by a new paradigm, scientists adopt new instruments and look in new places. Now, it's not as if Kuhn wanted to deny an objective reality. By the same token, he really thought that scientists are so deeply committed and cognitively committed to certain ways of understanding nature that shaped what reality meant in the mind of the scientists. This really is a profound and ended up being a very controversial way of seeing science. The other thing that Kuhn emphasized, and this is very interesting, is that the way in which people come into paradigms is not just by shopping for their favorite theory, but by being taught. He especially emphasized the role of textbooks in training young scientists to believe certain things about the natural world, to do calculations in certain ways, to employ certain kinds of instrument and modes of analysis. And just to give you one other quote, he says, scientists never learn concepts, laws, and theories in the abstract and by themselves. Instead, these intellectual tools are from the start encountered in a historically and pedagogically prior unit that displays them with and through their applications. After it has been accepted, those same applications or others accompany the theory into the textbooks. And he argued, in fact, that often it's the youngest generations that adopt a paradigm once it is finally getting into the textbooks, and sometimes an older paradigm won't die out until the older practitioners finally retire or fade from the scene altogether, which is a feature that's common in scientific life or academic life generally. It's the only way ultimately to achieve victory in an academic debate is wait for your enemies to die, which in a world of tenure can take a very long time. So what I'd like to do now is tell you what I think Kuhn got right, what he got wrong, and then talk about some of my own work in which I've tried to use Kuhn's ideas fruitfully. And that part, I actually have a paper that's coming out on this subject that was written for a volume in celebration of the 50th anniversary of Kuhn's book. So I thought I'd give you a take on how a contemporary historian of science would continue to use Kuhn. So first of all, what did Kuhn get wrong? Well, the idea of scientific change through revolutions never really caught on. I mean, in some ways it did catch on, in that by the 60s and 70s and 80s, people were referring to epochs in science beyond the so-called scientific revolution of the 17th century, using the same sorts of terms. Like people would refer to the chemical revolution, the quantum mechanical revolution, the Darwinian revolution, even molecular biology was described as a revolution. So in that sense, the term did catch on. But the idea that most scientific changes occur through these dramatic ruptures in which one view of reality fades away and another takes hold, kind of in hold, really was never fully accepted. And Kuhn himself actually abandoned that idea. He died of lung cancer in the 1990s, but even at the time he died, he was trying to complete a second big work that was an evolutionary understanding of scientific change rather than a revolutionary understanding. And it's interesting to reflect on what it meant to argue in favor of revolution at the beginning of the 1960s. I mean, obviously, by the end of that decade, revolution had taken on a different meaning. But there are other thinkers as well in that time period that really fixed on the notion of rupture as being important. And here I think especially of Michel Foucault's epistemes. So I mean, there was something in the air about thinking about these big changes, but I think that, by and large, doesn't characterize the way in which most historians of science would talk about the past now. Another thing that many people would say Kuhn got wrong is paradigms, in that the word is used in so many different ways in the book. And philosophers were especially irked that Kuhn didn't define this term precisely. One philosopher, in a review of the book, isolated 21 different ways in which she said the word was used. And Kuhn himself, in the postscript that was published in the 1970 edition, addressed directly the problems with how nebulous that term was, although he still insisted that there was something about that example finding a pattern that was really important to his picture. And I'll speak more about that in a few minutes. So if those things were things that Kuhn, in effect, what we would say got wrong, what did he get right? Well, I would actually say paradigms is something he got right too. Because even though it's not a rigorous concept philosophically, its emphasis on knowledge being relative to these conceptual frameworks and embedded in practice has really been taken up by history of science. People don't use the word paradigm very often in history of science, but they often think about ideas, practices, examples, instruments, all being tied together. And the fact that textbooks are the way that you learn how these things hang together. And in that sense, the kind of unit that Kuhn was identifying, I think we really have continued to see that a fruitful approach. Another thing I think he got right is that his idea of normal science, kind of the non-revolutionary phase of science, really caught something about how scientists work. And many scientists who read the book find this to be very descriptive, even if it's not so inspiring. Much of what they do is problem solving, and it builds on the work of others. They're not overthrowing major theories, but extending the body of knowledge. And also, science is not rule-bound. It often has to do with following examples, not following rules. And Kuhn really understood that, and he saw ways in which philosophers of science had tried to reduce scientific practice to something much too constrained and logical. He thought of it as something much richer and more analogical, more related to instruments. What else did Kuhn get right? I think something about his insights about conversion, such as that quote that I read you about the Gestalt theory, really does capture the kind of aha moment that scientists often have when things click for them, when they see a new way of interpreting something, whether it's kind of a small scale finding or something on a larger scale. So I think there's something about that, although we're often, we're hesitant to ever use the term conversion. I think he was onto something there. And lastly, his emphasis on teaching and training, I think, has been extremely fruitful as historians of science have tried to understand how certain fields take off and why others perhaps don't take off. And how it is that, in a large field, so many scientists can approach problems in similar ways. So that's actually been very fruitful. So let me shift gears a little bit and show you what it might look like to give something of a Kuhnian view of modern biomedicine. Now, it has to be said at the outside that most of Kuhn's examples in the structure of scientific revolutions are from the physical sciences. He himself admits that. He says that he did not include evidence from biology, quote, partly to increase this essay's coherence and partly on grounds of present competence. I mean, his background was in physics, not in biology. But his elaboration on paradigms in the 1969 postscript made very telling use of biologists, and commenting on how scientific communities exist at numerous scales, he talked about these groups. Oh, and I first meant to read you this quote. I skipped ahead of myself. And I wanted to really focus in on his use of the word model. And here I'm especially going to build on the things that he put in the postscript after the book had been so heavily criticized, but also so influential. He addressed the nebulousness of the term paradigm. And he says, by choosing paradigms, I mean to suggest that some accepted examples of actual scientific practice, examples which include law, theory, application, and instrumentation together, provide models from which spring particular coherent traditions of scientific research. And this really caught my imagination when I first read Kuhn when I was a PhD student in biochemistry at Berkeley, because models are so important in the biological sciences. And he goes on to say, that's actually, I'm sorry, in the beginning of the first edition, he goes on to say in the postscript, a paradigm as sheer an example is the central element of what I now take to be the most novel and least understood aspect of the book. Exemplars will therefore require more attention than other sorts of components in the disciplinary matrix. And what he tried to do in the postscript was to disaggregate the different uses of the term paradigm. Because in the book, he would use paradigm to both refer to very large-scale frameworks like Newtonian mechanics, and also to smaller-scale examples like the gyroscope. So he tried to say maybe there's certain examples that can be caught by the term exemplar, And these larger frameworks are more like a disciplinary matrix, which all physicists might share. And in talking about how paradigms function for different groups, he began to talk about the different sizes of the communities at stake. And the examples that he gave is you have all natural sciences, for example, scientists, then you have disciplines, then you have subgroups, such as protein chemists, or solid-state physicists, or radio astronomers. And it's at that smaller level, he said, you can start to see something interesting. So he said it's only at the next lower level, that group of small communities, that empirical problems emerge. How, to take a contemporary example, would one have isolated the phage group prior to its public claim? For this purpose, one must have recourse to attendance at special conferences, to the distribution of draft manuscripts or galley proofs prior to publication, and above all, to formal and informal communication networks, including those discovered in correspondence and in the linkages among citations. Now, it's not surprising that the phage group was a conspicuous example of a research community for Kuhn. Max Delbruck, Salvador Luria, and Alfred Hershey had shared the 1968 Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology and Medicine for their work on bacteriophage. And here you see a picture of Delbruck and Luria. I don't have a picture of Hershey, but this is them as they relaxed at a Cold Spring Harbor symposium in 1953. The symposia are very informal, as you can see. Luria is not even wearing a shirt. But these three individuals, Hershey not being pictured, were considered to be the founders or even fathers of phage biology, which was a major contributor to the development of molecular biology. And they tended to gather at Cold Spring Harbor, also at Caltech. What united this group of researchers was not a conceptual schema or a textbook, though Jim Watson did publish a wonderful textbook that did help to perpetuate their ideas when he published Molecular Biology of the Gene in 1965. But that group really gathered around a common research material, which was the T-even phages of bacteria. And here you see an electron micrograph of T4 bacteriophage. And this phage group maintained informal communication of their unpublished results through a newsletter. They used their gatherings at Cold Spring Harbor and camping trips from Caltech into the mountains of Southern California to communicate their findings, and also used these meetings to draw in new acolytes. And here you see a group of them at Caltech gathered around Max Delbruck. And this is Gunther Stedt, who was also an active researcher in this and who published quite a bit on the phage group. In their sharing of materials and information, they consciously emulated the network of Drosophila researchers, for which Caltech was also prominent through the work of T.H. Morgan. And interestingly, Delbruck put some constraints on what this group would and wouldn't work on. So he chose the T-even bacteriophages because there's a property of some bacteriophage that wasn't shared by, it's called lysogeny, that these particular bacteriophage didn't show. And he thought that was too complicated. He didn't even know if he believed in it, so he told everybody they had to work on this particular set so they could get the results they could agree on. So it's not just that it's friendly and informal, but there's also a certain amount of discipline that it takes to be in this particular group. So phage, Drosophila, biologists commonly refer to such well-studied common research organisms or objects as model systems. Many, like strains of laboratory mice, have been standardized through breeding for decades or can be obtained commercially. And here you see, there's laboratory mouse, obviously, zebrafish, Arabidopsis, C. elegans with a nematode worm, which has been very important in developmental genetics, Drosophila, and I'm pretty sure that's yeast, which are some of the most important model systems that biologists are still doing work on. These model systems are valued for their particularity, materiality, and complexity, but their key characteristic is surely typicality. They're usually regarded as typical for whatever process is being investigated. Moreover, model systems exhibit a self-reinforcing quality. The more it is studied, the more perspectives from which it is understood, the more it becomes a model system. So model systems, I would argue, function quite clearly as exemplars in Kuhn's sense, if not exactly in his terms. Kuhn talked a lot about problem-solving, calculations, theories, but the kind of symbolic generalizations that are really important in physics don't occur so often in biomedical research. Yet Kuhn himself stressed how similarities are embodied in physical situations rather than rules or laws. So in the passage on exemplars in his postscript that I already quoted from, Kuhn offers up an analysis of how Newton's second law of motion could be extended by analogy to apply to new situations, such as free fall, harmonic oscillators, or the gyroscope, which I have a picture of here. Such an extension requires the physics student to learn to identify forces, masses, and accelerations in a variety of physical situations not previously encountered, as he says, as well as to design the appropriate version of F equals ma through which to interrelate them. It involves, in other words, learning to see a problem as like a problem already encountered, again using his phrase there. And Kuhn then goes on to present a brief historical example involving Huygens' analysis of Galileo's point pendula and Bernoulli's extension of Huygens' pendula to describe the flow of water. And I'm not going to go through the specifics of the example, but just draw your attention to his conclusion. That example, he says, should begin to make clear what I mean by learning from problems to see situations as like each other, as subjects for the application of the same scientific laws or law sketch. Simultaneously, it should show why I refer to the consequential knowledge of nature acquired while learning the similarity relationship and thereafter embodied in a way of viewing physical situations rather than in rules or laws. It's not just a matter of having the equation, in other words, it's how you correlate the different physical situations in which the equation is made to work. It's the analogies that you draw. So Kuhn's depiction of how scientists extend knowledge to unexplored areas through analogies to well-worked problems or subjects actually describes surprisingly well how model systems function in biomedicine. So take the phage group already mentioned. Some of its members sought to apply the visual method they used to detect and quantify bacteriophage, namely the appearance of phage plaques on a petri dish, to animal viruses. So here you have a petri dish of E. coli, and each one of these circles represents a colony that was originally one bacteriophage, which has infected the cells closest to it. And as those cells reproduce and have the phage in them, after a certain amount of time, the phage causes those cells to lyse, because it is a pathogen after all. It's not so good for the E. coli. And when the cells lyse, it leaves this kind of translucent circle of dead cells. So each one of these then represents one bacteriophage. And what was nice about this is that you could quantify the amount of bacteriophage in a certain culture of bacteria. You know how many cells of bacteria you have. And you could also isolate mutants. So if there was a particular plaque that had an unusual shape or a different feature that showed you something was different about that bacteriophage, you could isolate it by putting a little glass pipette over that particular hole and growing that up in a new culture, so to perpetuate that strain. And what the phage researchers began to do as research on animal viruses was becoming more important is to figure out similar ways of growing and representing animal viruses. So here you see Western equine encephalitis virus also grown here on a layer of cell culture, in which, again, each one of these holes represents where a virus has infected those cells. And this also became significant in polio research, which was cultured in the same way. And in addition, tumor viruses began to be cultured in this way, except instead of making a hole in the cell culture, they would transform the cells. That became kind of the signature of their infection. So as Howard Kemen has described an assay that he and Harry Rubin developed for Rous sarcoma virus, which is a tumor virus, the foci, these are the transformed cells, were the cell culture analogs of tumors in chickens. So they were working from a virus that had been isolated from tumors in chickens, and they were able to, in a plate similar to this, have each one of the foci represent one of those viruses. Moreover, because some bacteriophage could insert themselves into the DNA of E. coli, this is what was called lysogeny, being latent until conditions changed, the analogy between bacteriophage and tumor viruses opened up a different way to think about tumor viruses in their host cells. In other words, to think how the tumor viruses might become embedded in the genomes of their host cells. And this actually led researchers to discover analogs to virus cells or latent viruses in those cellular genomes. So it's both the way in which the materials are handled and also kind of the conceptual apparatus or the theory, the way that you think about what a virus can do, where it can be, what kind of material it can carry. Now, in the 1950s, bacteriophage was not the only exemplar for viruses and how you could visualize or work with viruses. In Wendell Stanley's laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, his group began to investigate poliovirus along the lines of another well-studied virus, which is called tobacco mosaic virus. And my first book is all about tobacco mosaic virus as a model system, so this is a character and a discovery that I know well. So in 1935, Wendell Stanley had crystallized tobacco mosaic virus, and 20 years later, his group was investigating poliovirus in similar ways, and they were able, using surplus poliovirus vaccine fluid, to get enough material to crystallize poliovirus. So here you see these needle-shaped crystals of tobacco mosaic virus. The virus structure itself is a very long rod, which is why when it makes these crystals, they're actually paracrystals, they're very long, whereas polio makes more conventional crystals. And then these were used by Rosalind Franklin. You know Rosalind Franklin, whose work on DNA photograph 51 was so important for Watson and Crick's deduction of double helical structure. She left the lab where she was working with Maurice Wilkins in London to go to a different lab, Birkbeck lab, and she began to work on virus structure. And she actually took some of the poliovirus crystals from Stanley's laboratory and began to do the X-ray crystallography of poliovirus, and was making significant progress when she died, unfortunately at a young age. She was only 38, but people in her laboratory continued that research. And they showed that poliovirus possesses icosahedral symmetry, just like that of spherical plant viruses, tobacco yellow mosaic virus being one. That's not the same as tobacco mosaic virus. So this is an example of biophysical research rather than genetic research, in which a particular well-studied virus provided an exemplar for studying other kinds of viruses, viruses especially that might have relevance for human health. Yes. So as you can see from these examples in virus research, whereas Kuhn largely emphasized the role of theory in problem-solving, conceptual work, a model systems approach brings out the centrality of experimentation and analogies at the leading edge of scientific change. What scientists take from these exemplars, like bacteriophage or tobacco mosaic virus, is not necessarily a way to see the world differently, as to handle that world differently, to rearrange it, to grow it. And even then, such examples are not static. Rather than seeing the exemplars as fixed or rigid, they are better seen as kind of changeable points of reference. Tobacco mosaic virus provided a different model in 1935 than it did in 1965, when people were trying to use it to think about the genetic code. At another level, these model systems unfold in time and often in unpredictable ways. And historians and philosophers who've written on model systems have often emphasized the kind of unpredictability, the surprise that can happen when you're studying something like Drosophila or bacteriophage. And this provides, in some ways, a different way, and perhaps more positive way, of thinking about anomalies, seeing them not as catalysts for crisis, but maybe motors of scientific change in a positive way. Okay. So, just to give you one other example of, one of the best-known exemplars in biomedical research, and this has been well studied by Robert Kohler, who wrote a really wonderful book called Lords of the Fly, looking at Drosophila genetics. Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly, came into T.H. Morgan's laboratory and became an exquisite tool for mapping where on chromosomes genes lie, because you could get inbred strains of flies and look at recombination rates in order to figure out which genes are linked and how far away they were from each other. Kohler refers to fly as a breeder reactor, because once the system was stabilized in the Morgan laboratory, they were finding more mutants than they could map. So they began shipping the flies all over the country to college teachers and colleagues. It was such an incredible resource that it promoted a kind of an ethos of sharing materials and credit. And in that sense, Kohler says, the kind of style of work, the moral economy of working with the fruit fly was very much related to the material conditions of working with these flies, in which they bred so rapidly, you could find so many mutants that there was more work than you could possibly finish. Now, model systems also, I've been talking about model systems as if, this is a model system. And part of what I want to say about the use of model systems is there's also something abstract when you talk about a model system. Somebody might say my model system is fly or phage or nematode worm, but they're not actually referring to one particular fly. And in that sense, there is an idealization that happens. And this kind of slippage or ambiguity between the particular and the general is actually part of what makes the system productive. I mean, to refer to one system as Drosophila is not to, say that fly. Standing behind that one fly are many actual flies and likely many different strains of flies in conjunction with relevant practices of genetic experimentation. Now, if the power of model organisms derives in part from the practices and know-how that have accumulated around each of these particularly amenable organisms, they're also supported by the analogies that are drawn between these organisms and humans, and especially the health problems that humans have. In the world of post-war biomedicine, the way in which a researcher's system has been made into a model for a particular disease or process is absolutely key to its place in biomedical research. It often provides the justification for the day-to-day activities of laboratory scientists who are fulfilling this purpose through their basic research. And this is just off the NIH website, but it's a listing of many of the model organisms upon which NIH grants are lavished, because these model organisms are so important to understanding problems that are relevant for human health. And sometimes the organisms that are studied don't have exactly the same diseases, and yet the mutations or the processes that are studied in them can provide key insight into what goes on in our own bodies so that human diseases can be understood. And part of what I'm trying to point to is how important these model systems are for the kind of post-war biomedicine that is highly valued by taxpayers, to say the least. And we pay for a lot of people to work on flies and mice, not because flies and mice are so personally important to us, but they can be made into models for understanding our own diseases and health processes. So in closing, let me return to Kuhn's observation that key theories or concepts are often embodied in physical situations, such as the pendulum. They're then extended by analogy to new situations. In the same way, I've tried to show you, model systems function for biologists as exemplars whose utility derives from their typicality, solvability, and unpredictability. Insofar as my use of model system has been somewhat imprecise, am I really saying the organism or the representation, the package, or the tools, the materials, or all of the above? You could say that it shares the same weaknesses as Kuhn's paradigm, which was maddeningly malleable too. And I would also readily admit that I've departed from the spirit of Kuhn in particular ways. I haven't paid much attention to textbooks and pedagogy, for instance. Not that the role of bacteriophage in teaching molecular biology is unimportant, but my interest here has been less in the codification of exemplars for teaching them to students than at looking at the dynamics of their use by researchers, for which these points of reference as standards or models are in flux. And it's this understanding of exemplars from Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions that I find so illuminating for biomedicine. And just to give you one little glance at what I haven't told you about tonight, which is the book that was mentioned earlier, should you want to find out about radioisotopes, which is another feature of the study of kind of the materiality of biomedical research. All my work is about kind of material things. This is what was just published. So thank you very much. So I'm happy to take some questions. We'll bring the lights up a little bit. If anybody has questions, complaints? Yes, go ahead.
When Kuhn referred to conceptual pattern changes or paradigm shifts, as Dr. Cole one, and then he said that when that occurred, that the world actually changed. Was that just sophomore writing?
I think he's
try to get people's attention and also to show how seriously he took cognition and kind of our conceptual framework and how we understand the world. I mean, part of what's brilliant about the book, frankly, and I admire the book very much, is that he makes these very strong statements and then he qualifies them. So he's, he says these are incommensurable. Of course, that doesn't mean people can't talk to each other. Or the world changes, but of course that doesn't mean there isn't a real world. I mean, I think he's trying to capture something nuanced. So, he's not trying to say the world doesn't exist, but he is trying to say the way we see the world really does depend on how we've been trained to see it. And that you see a different world. There was a passage that I didn't read you, but he talks about how in the Aristotelian framework, that was important before the 17th century. Here's just to give a quote. The change from an Aristotelian explanation for why something falls to a mechanical one involves the following. A stone under an Aristotelian framework fell because its nature compelled it to. And in the 17th century, people began to think that as just a tautology. And that was because they had a different paradigm for understanding the properties of that stone. So, the entire, as Kuhn says, the entire flux of sensory appearances, including color, taste, and even weight, was to be explained now in terms of size, shape, position, and motion of the elementary corpuscles of base matter. The attribution of other qualities to the elementary atoms, saying that it was in its nature to fall, for instance, was a resort to the occult and therefore out of bounds of science. So, he was saying that when you went from seeing things in an Aristotelian framework to the mechanical framework that characterized the period of the scientific revolution, things looked different. You thought about them in different ways. And I think that's what he's trying to get at when he talks about the world changing. So, I don't take him quite literally, but he's onto something interesting. The other thing I didn't mention is that early on, even before he finished his physics PhD, he was reading the works of Jean Piaget, who wrote on the different conceptual developmental stages of children. And he began to think about science, too, as going through certain developmental stages. And it's like when you come to a new paradigm, you can see new kinds of things. So he was very interested in psychology and in cognitive science as providing a window onto how scientists do their work. Yes?
From the ongoing discussion on climate change, is that is a scientific shift in paradigm where we have problem understanding something which used to be looked at differently than?
So this brings up a very interesting issue. So at the time that Kuhn began to write his book, because he was working on these ideas in the 1950s, for the period from World War II into the 1950s, many sociologists of science, and also people like James Conant, presented science as if it was it provided grounds beyond politics, religion, superstition for understanding what was rational. They thought science could help democracy by providing other kinds of ways of understanding how people should make decisions than kind of conventional ways or political ways. Science was not seen as inherently political. And interestingly, Kuhn, in his book, I think a bit unwittingly, because of his references to politics and religion, suggests that science is dominated by the possibility for kind of dogma, coercion, affiliation, in ways that people really hadn't thought of science previously. And one of the reasons that people didn't like Kuhn's book, and one of the reasons he felt misunderstood, is that people thought he was saying that science was only about some sort of belief or superstition, that there was no rational grounds for believing in a particular scientific theory. And Kuhn would not have said that. He actually thought he had a much more complicated understanding of rationality than trying to see it as just logic or rules. But you can see that once you begin to think of science as a political process, it can open the way to thinking science can be captive to a political process. And no matter what your views are on climate change, people tend to think that the opposite view is that scientific view being captive to a certain political persuasion. So there's a sense in which Kuhn's work ushered in a way of thinking about science as political or cultural that's made it harder for scientists to appeal to the objective basis for their beliefs. And I think practically, too, the relationship between scientists and the state and to party politics has changed. And there is a more deliberate attempt, both on the part of industry and government officials, to find scientists who will agree with them and to present a particular view as a scientific view. So I think there are certain things that have changed, but I don't think Kuhn would not have been happy that climate change was taken out of the realm of scientific consensus so much into the public realm that, that scientific expertise no longer counts for what it once did. So he wasn't trying to affect that change in this, and yet there are ways in which his picture opens up to that kind of an understanding of science as politically vulnerable. Yes?
What would you point out as examples since the last 51 years, examples of these kinds of changes, paradigm shifts? And let me toss out things maybe at opposite ends of the scale. One might be H. pylori and ulcers. Is that an example? How does that fit in? Or dark matter? Can you do something larger than that? How do these things and anything else that you might think of as a major application of this play in?
I guess I don't think in terms of large-scale paradigm changes when I think about science, but in part it's because I'm often interested in what happens at the laboratory bench and not what happens in kind of big theories. But in that sense, your H. pylori example appeals to me. I do think there's a way in which that was a reconceptualization at the material level of what causes a particular kind of disease. And there was, that example also illustrates very well the resistance. And that once people changed explanation, they just thought about it a completely different way. So I do think that provides a really interesting example for thinking of paradigm in that sense, not as being about all of biomedicine, but about a particular etiology for a particular disease. And I think in some ways, if you break paradigm down and begin to think about exemplars, examples, or think about it in a more concrete and small scale way, that his theory works better. I just don't know physics well enough to talk about the dark matter example. I think there are also ways of seeing larger scale trends in biology. For example, a shift from simple explanations which would attribute traits to a single gene to network explanations of genetic effects and also epigenetics. Similarly, computational biology has been related to more interest in emergent properties and networks more generally. That is different than the kind of pathways and control mechanisms that scientists had in mind when, for instance, when the Human Genome Project began. So one can think about that kind of conceptual reorientation as a paradigm shift, but I'm a little hesitant to do it in kind of a monolithic way. I think a lot of times the important scientific changes can be small scale, but then they can be propagated if a particular scientific accomplishment becomes a model that other people begin to emulate. Yes?
I'm not sure I can get this, or articulate this properly, but I'm thinking, just as there is a kind of political direction now in science, which we didn't recognize before, I'm thinking about the kinds of shifts in studies of economics and psychology. There is now a much greater interest in and on irrational behavior rather than rational behavior. Now that strikes me as a huge shift, especially in economics.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a very interesting example of a conceptual shift. And along these lines, it's a little bit different than, this is a different answer than the question you asked, but I think it's also interesting. So I edited a book with a few colleagues looking at model systems in many different fields. Using the idea of a model system and looking at things like model systems in different fields, including social sciences, for example. And one of the papers in the book is by a historian and philosopher of economics named Mary Morgan. She's really fantastic and just published a big book last year on the history of economics. but it's on Prisoner's Dilemma as a kind of a model for game theory and how important that was in shaping, many different theories, but certainly in economics as well. But you're absolutely right that, another kind of figure that's been important for economics is kind of the rational man.
Yeah.
And, the irrational man has also become important now. And I think that work is very interesting. Kuhn was hesitant to see his own models applied to the social sciences. He felt kind of nervous about that. He was most comfortable in physics. And interestingly, in the 1960s and 70s, practitioners in fields that wanted to show they were scientific would often try to show that their fields had all the requisite features of Kuhnian paradigm, for instance, or revolution. And Kuhn really hated that use of his theory as a way to try to show that something, that a particular field would qualify as scientific. But I certainly think that ideas about knowledge and research apply equally well to the social sciences as to the natural sciences, on myself. So that's a great question. Other questions? Yes?
Just wondering, how about the role of bacteria as a killer for the paradigm shift? That'd be traumatic.
Well, there's been an interesting shift in that way in the last few years, because certainly, at the end of the 19th century with the germ theory of disease, and right through the 20th century with the attention to, with the attempts to solve infectious diseases always through killing bacteria, we tend to think of ourselves and bacteria as separate. And now with all the attention to kind of the flora and fauna and the microbes that grow as our ecosystem, there's been a reconceptualization of kind of the necessity of microbes in human health. So I think that is another really interesting example, like H. pylori, where the conception of what causes disease, what health is, has really shifted. I think not so much at the practical level yet, but certainly at the theoretical level, there's a lot of research going on in that. And I think that will bring about changes, and not just because of antibiotic-resistant strains, which are pretty terrifying, as it is. So, and I think microbes are great. Not that I want to get sick with them, but the science that we've learned from E. coli, from salmonella, from bacteriophage is just amazing. So I have a lot of respect for these model organisms. Also when we have fruit flies at home, my family gets annoyed with me because I'll say, don't kill it, don't kill it. It's taught us so much about fruit flies. You have to honor the fruit fly.
I say, take your bacteria to lunch.
Interestingly, in Japan, there's always been a different mentality about microbes than in the West because they've been used for fermentation science for so long. I have a graduate student who's finishing up a dissertation that looks at the history of fermentation science and technology in Japan over the last century. And she talks about how in Japanese, culture and science, there's an idea of the beneficent microbe. So, and I think that's now coming around a bit in the way we think about medicine, but that's always been important there. I think about, sake or miso, harnessing the productive capacity of microbes has often been really significant in Asia. Yes? I don't know if it's hard for me to see here on this. Go ahead.
I'm not sure I can articulate it very well. The paradigm seems to me to be something that is there. Is it a good thing, or is it something that is actually inhibiting development? Is it something that has to be overcome? Does it trap people? And do younger generations manage to come up with their own paradigms and challenge the older ones? Is that the process?
I think so, and I can't channel Kuhn here completely, but to my mind, the picture he presents of paradigms is a productive picture. That science, the way that we have of knowing the natural world that is science relies on paradigms. So, but paradigms also have their limits. And interestingly, in one part of the book, he talks about how when one paradigm goes away, you actually lose knowledge. And in this sense, he's trying to contest a view of science, which science is always accumulating more and more and more. In his view, as a kind of new conceptual frameworks orient science, the older science that used to be knowledge gets kind of forgotten or doesn't have meaning anymore, is somehow lost. So I think that's a very interesting view and not entirely wrong. I mean, there is something funny about Kuhn's picture in that he's deeply historical in his examples, and yet he suggests that there's a trans-historical feature of science. There's this thing that's a paradigm that stands outside of science. Paradigms don't have a history. And I think now many historians of science would want to see every feature of science as being historical, as arising in, I mean, I guess you could say it arose in the scientific revolution because that's when modern science starts, but that still begs the question. So I think where I would press against Kuhn is in assuming that there's one theory that would explain all science in all time in every place. So, and I think most scientists, most historians of science now tend to be much more local and circumspect in their theories. But it's part of what's exciting about Kuhn's book is the fact that it was so bold. I mean, and it really is an essay even more than a book. He kind of takes you through this idea, and it's like opening a window. It's like, wow. And I think for many readers who are scientists respond to it because there are a lot of things he kind of gets about how science is done. The personal allegiances and commitments and blindnesses and battles. I think much of how he characterizes science feels familiar and right to people who've, done research, at least in the late 20th century. So, yeah, I tend to think paradigms are productive. Yes?
To follow up on what you just said, I think I understand when you talked about his influence on how we characterize the evolution of science, how we observe it. Has science itself been influenced by this picture of itself?
No, so it's kind of a meta question. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think that there are, as I mentioned, certain fields that have wanted to show their legitimacy in science have appealed to Kuhn, not least creationism. So I think, depending on what your views are, not in always in saltatory ways, but certainly that picture of science has been used by many different people to try to promote their own scientific field or conviction. But whether Kuhn's picture has actually changed, for example, the way physics research is done now or molecular biology, I'm not so sure. I think the term paradigm is out there and people find it a useful way to think about things, but it's also kind of become completely banal now, as the cartoons show. There's lots of those cartoons, by the way. But I think in the end, it's been more a kind of a thing to reflect with rather than a catalyst for change in the course of 20th century science. But it's a very interesting question.